Today, I am here with Michael Hess, who spent over 30 years in the United States Army, retiring in 2003 with the rank of colonel. During his time, he served in civil affairs, and between 1995 and 2000, played a role liaising with the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia, UN Mission in Kosovo, and NATO. Good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Holland.
Can you please state your full name for the record?
Michael Edward Hess.
And today's date is the 6th of December, 2023. Now, last we spoke, Mike, we left off with Operation Provide Comfort in 1991 Iraq. Can you describe how this mission transitioned into Bosnia and how you became involved in the lead up towards Bosnia and the establishment of civil affairs in that mission?
Sure. That's a very good point, because I think one of the key factors was Operation Provide Comfort increased the visibility of civil affairs and its capabilities for the European Command staff. They had very little experience with civil affairs at the strategic level, but after Provide Comfort, they realized the value of it. And so you had senior leaders now who had been there, who had experienced it, and so they knew to call on civil affairs a lot more. We had placed a civil affairs officer on the staff, so that was good. We had now had a section at European Command, so we could play off of that. Obviously, in 1991, you're starting to see the increase in hostilities in Bosnia. They also had us involved because the Berlin Wall had come down, and we were starting to develop mill-to-mill contacts and relationships with the countries out of East Central Europe. They invited us to participate in those tours, and so General Benchoff invited us, and we went along with him. So it was important. They knew we had value, and they were starting to use us a lot more. As things got more serious in Bosnia, it was clear there was going to be an intervention. It was not clear who was going to do that intervention. The Europeans said they were going to take care of it. It wasn't happening very well. And so by the time 1995 comes along and the massacre in Srebrenica, it becomes important that the US military get involved and NATO get involved, and it be a NATO operation. We had been on a number of planning missions up until then. There was the Vance-Owen agreement that looked like it was going to have a peace settlement, and therefore we needed an intervention. So there were a couple of starts in there where we had sent planning teams to EUCOM, European Command, to participate in the planning for the lead up of those operations. Those never matured. Also in this time was the Rwandan genocide. We were involved in that. We had sent a civil affairs team to help in the relief operations around Goma. So we had done some, we were still working with European Command on that. So that was good for their understanding, the staff's understanding. And that was very helpful because General Jamerson had gone from 2 stars to 4 stars, and he was now the deputy at European Command. And when Goma happened, he asked the J5, have you called for the civil affairs planners? And of course the J5's an Air Force 2-star. He has no idea what civil affairs is. And he kind of looked at him like, what? And he says, the civil affairs, the 353rd Civil Affairs Command, have you asked for their planning team? And he said, no. And he says, well, you need to go find them. And he did. And so now we had some visibility at the senior levels of European Command, and we were being asked and requested. So when it finally came time to write the plan, the intervention plan, in November, late October, November of 1995, they called us and asked us if we could come over and help in the planning process to write the civil military annex to the campaign plan. And so we sent a team over. I was part of that team in October. Now remember, the Dayton Accords haven't even started yet. So when you think about guidance, where's the guidance? Well, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a peace agreement yet, it was complicated. But that often happens at that level. When they teach you in the classroom that you're going to get guidance and senior level guidance, sometimes it's missing. The guidance we had from the President of the United States was we would only be there for 1 year because there was an election coming up the following November. And so he was telling the American people, the U.S. would only be there for a year. It is difficult to write a plan for a 1-year intervention. So, but we were there, and we helped the EUCOM team by writing the CivMil Annex for the intervention, which happens, it was, the Dayton Accords were signed, it became called, then the French call it the Paris Accords, because it was signed in December in Paris, and then the intervention begins. The 353, we were mobilized early January and sent first in, we had a lead team that went into Zagreb, into Croatia, where they were planning the move in with I-4. And I-4 was headed by Admiral Snuffy Smith. And so we were up there with them. And then when we intervened, moved down into Sarajevo, I believe it was January 24th of '96 when we actually flew in one night into Sarajevo. So that's how we got started in Bosnia.
Now, can you talk a little bit about what the Office of the High Representative is, how you came to work in it, and how this led you to form a working relationship with Mr. Jotkovi?
Now, this is a long story, so we got time. So in most of peacekeeping operations, you have a UN mission. Because of the long, drawn-out, complicated fighting that had gone on in Bosnia for the last 4 years, and the fact that that had been a UN peacekeeping mission, it was decided not to have the UN lead that part of the operation. There was a collection of nations, 53 of them, that got together, and they chose a high representative. It was Carl Bildt. And so he was going to represent these 53 nations, which were in fact led by a group of 12. And so they would be the international organization overseeing the civilian side of the peace implementation for Dayton. So it's a little bit strange, but they acted almost exactly like, and there was a UN mandate for it. There was a resolution. We had all of that. It just wasn't a UN-led operation. There were UN agencies there. UNHCR, Søren Jessen-Petersen was heading, because there were 250,000 Bosnians displaced that we had to get back into the country. So UNHCR was there, World Food Program was there, WHO, World Health Organization. They were all there, but it was not under a UN mission. So the High Rep's office was the focal point of the civilian part of the operation. We recognized early on that we needed to try and get some representation on that, or help them on that staff. If we were gonna, remember we talked about CMOX last time. Well, if we don't even have the two highest levels, I-4 and OHR, working together, how are we gonna have coordination down at the lower levels? So we started trying to meet with them, with the High Rep's office. But remember, Carl Bildt had been very poorly treated by the Americans. He was only invited to the Dayton Peace Accords as an observer. He was pretty mistreated by this process. And so he was wary of Americans and the intervention in working with them, rightfully so. He was also not very happy with U.S. military leadership because he had had some unfortunate interactions with them as well. So here we are, Americans, military, trying to help him out. Here, we're here to help. And he's looking, I've heard that story before. I've seen that movie and it didn't end well. So we weren't making a whole lot of headway. Then comes a man named Dan Schroeder, a retired 3-star. He had been the deputy commander at U.S. Army Europe, great guy. We had met with him a couple of times after Rwanda, because he led the intervention in Rwanda. So we knew of General Schroeder. He is appointed by SACEUR, General Jowan, to be the civilian coordinator. So he had this, in all the planning, we would see this civilian coordinator, high civilian coordinator, and we're going, who is this person? So General Jowan had a concept who this was going to be, but he never let us know until early January. And then he was introduced to General Matthews. And he comes over, I want to say early February, maybe the second week in February. And he spends his time, he's an incredibly bright man, incredibly. I was sitting there briefing him the day he arrived on our plans, and he looks at me and he said, "What company were you in?" I said, "Excuse me, sir?" He said, "What company were you in at West Point?" I said, "Company A3. And he said, "I thought so," because he was the TAC of B3. And he remembered me from then. And it's just uncanny. That guy had a great mind. So there were 3 of us on the CA team who worked with him. General Matthews, he's the commander, the deputy John Petrella, and I was the ops officer. So I was working with him because I'd done the planning, and so we were going to implement the plan. So he would go out and we kind of laid out, where the problems were, what he ought to be focusing on. He would do, but he used us, and then he would come back every other day or so, and we would go off to a little room. It was on the top floor of this building in an attic, and he would brief us back, and we'd knock around ideas, war game stuff. Then near the end, he says, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You need to send somebody to the high rep's office." And we're going, "Really?" We knew that. And he said, "Yeah, I know that." And he says, "You're going to send him." And he pointed at me. And General Matthews says, "No way in hell. He's my ops officer. He can't go." "Shut up, Tom. He's going." And then I said, "I can't go, sir. I'm the ops." He said, "Shut up, Mike. You're going." And he had worked this. He says, "I have talked to Jock Covey." Jock was the senior U.S. representative in the high rep's office. So it was Carl Bildt, Mike Steiner, Jock Covey. So he said, "You're going to go work for Jock Covey. You have an interview with him tonight at 6 o'clock. Go get ready. Don't blow the interview. Nothing else." I said, "Thanks for the guidance, boss." So I go off, I meet Jock at the Hotel Europa, and we have dinner together. And I have a 3-hour interview with Jock Covey, at the end of which he says, "Okay, that's fine. I'm going to recommend you to Carl Bildt, and you have to go interview with Carl Bildt, and we'll set up a meeting, but now you got to get Carl to agree to take you." I said, "Okay, that's fine." And so they set up. It actually happened pretty fast. I think it was the next day. So the next day I go to Carl Bildt's office, knowing he's not fond of Americans. He's not fond of Americans in uniform, but he's the high rep, and the job is, General Schroeder said, "Mike, don't mess this up." So I go in, we sit down. Carl's from Sweden. He was the youngest prime minister in the history of Sweden. Extremely bright man, really, really incredibly bright man. So we sit down and we start talking, and I, at the time, was a banker at Citibank. And I was in charge of the relationships with the Nordic banks. Nordics obviously include Sweden. And so we started talking about Swedish banking. Svenska Handelsbanken, Skandinaviska Skuldensbanken, and the people I knew there and worked there, and he knew. And we started talking about the Wallenberg family. You've heard of the Wallenbergs from the senior gentleman was very instrumental in freeing a lot of Jewish people in East Central Europe, primarily Hungary. And so I knew the Wallenberg family from because it was his great nephew, I think, who was the chairman of Skandinaviska Skuldensbanken. So we were talking about him. So we spent 45 minutes talking about banking in Sweden, And he asked me a little bit about, the military stuff and the peacekeeping operation, but it was mainly 45 minutes talking about banking and relationships and that. So I walk out of the office afterwards. Jock says, "How'd it go?" So I said, "Great. We talked about banking for the whole time." And Jock looks at me like, "What?" I said, "Yeah, we talked about Swedish banking and some of the people we know and all that stuff." And he goes, "Huh." I walk out, heard later that night that I was accepted, and he said, "You can come join the staff and be Jock's special assistant." So the next morning I had to find civilian clothes because I was in uniform. I had to find civilian clothes. I had a blazer, had a couple of shirts, you know, so I was ready because I knew might have to travel around and meet with civilian agencies, which we should do. But Schroeder walks me out of the building that morning. He says, Mike, if you mess this, if you do this job well, nobody will ever know you were there. If you mess it up, we'll blame it all on you. Thanks, boss.
No pressure.
So off I went, and I started working for Jock. I was his special assistant. There were a group of 3 of us. Carl had 1, Michael had 1, and I was Jock's. And we worked together and prepared a lot of this stuff for the meetings and all that. And that's how I got to be in the High Rep's office.
Now going to your experience in that office. What were the most critical steps you took to supporting the peacebuilding mission in Bosnia, and what role did civilian-military coordination play within that peacebuilding mission?
Some of that I had done prior to going to the High Rep's office, because when we got there, I took the principles, some of the principles we had learned in northern Iraq about coordination meetings, CMOCs. So we had started to set those structures up. I had come out of northern Iraq thinking I knew a lot about humanitarian relief operations. I'd lived with Fred Cooney, and I was feeling pretty good about myself. And I got there and it was totally different. CARE used to do food distribution, and that's what they were known for. It's what they were formed for. I got there and I said, well, where's CARE? Where's the food distribution? They're doing child psychosocial therapy. I said, what? CARE's doing psychosocial? You're kidding me. Well, who's doing food? Well, Save the Children is. How? What? And so all of my preconceived ideas and all the training I'd gone through was wrong. Was wrong.
Imagine that.
So you had to adjust on the fly. I mean, UNHCR was still doing refugee, WFP still doing food, but the coordination meetings were key. And Catholic Relief Services was the senior NGO organization in Sarajevo, and they chaired the weekly coordination meeting. And I started going to that. And when I got to the High Rep's office, I said, we need to get plugged into this too, because not only does the military and the humanitarian relief community these are the people who are going to help us on the peacekeeping side of it too, because if we're going to build this peace, there's a principle about the effectiveness of a good humanitarian relief operation at the beginning, because the population, the people of Bosnia, have seen a lot of, at this point, 4 years of UN peacekeepers, 4 years of NGOs there, and had gone very well, you know. And so you got to build a credibility of the High Rep's office, of the peacekeepers, of the humanitarian relief community up again in their eyes. And so we needed a really successful humanitarian relief operation to help increase our credibility with the people of Bosnia. And so we started working on that very hard at the very beginning. And so that was an important lesson learned from Iraq, and then we translated that into not just what we did with I-4 and the Civ Mill side, but also with the High Rep's office. And Carl Bildt and Jock understood that inherently. We also had to work with, there was a great deal of anger, frustration by the women of Srebrenica. 7,000 men had been killed there. We didn't know the exact number of time. We knew there was a large number of them. And they were very organized, and they were a very vocal group of people. And Michael Steiner agreed to work with them because we had to address their grievances and try to find what happened to their families. And so he started working that. So we all had our niches that we were working to try and help the people of Bosnia so we can move forward in the In the meantime, we're coordinating. The plan was, and there was confusion about this, we had an election in 9 months to elect the interim leaders of the three entities, Republic of Srpska, Bosnia, and the Croatian area. And people say, well, why'd that have to happen so fast? Karadzic, who was the head of the Republic of Srpska, was indicted for war crimes. And if we held an election, the election said that you could not be an indicted war criminal and run for office. So if we had the elections within 90 days, then he would be gone. That was why, and people missed that, but it was important. We needed Karadzic out of the way because he was a bad influence, huge bad. And the hope was that the Republic of Srpska would pick a leader who would then be more willing to work with the Croats and the Bosniaks. Didn't work that way, but that was the plan, and we started working it. They also moved the headquarters from where the Republic of Srpska party was, from Pale up to Banja Luka. So that means we assisted them in that move. We also had to have an office up there from the High Rep's office. So we took a couple of civil affairs folks, came over to help. And Jock said, Mike, could you help us set up a new office in Banja Luka? I said, sure, we can do that. Call up some of our civil affairs guys. They help, they go up, they find the room, they find the space, the office, furnish it, get the telecoms in, so we were able to do stuff. And as a banker, we had to get the banking system up and running again. And I said, well, what's the SWIFT code for Bosnia? What do you mean? The SWIFT code, that's how you do international payment transfers. Really? Yeah, well, it turns out the SWIFT code was held by a bank in Banja Luka. So the Serbs, in fact, controlled the inflow, they didn't know it because they weren't bankers, but they controlled the inflow of money into the country. So I said, we have to get control, we, the administration, the interim administration, i.e. the High Rep's office, control of that so money can start to flow into the country through the banking system. So, things like that started to happen on a more regular basis, and we started to build, but it was hard because the entities were still acting like entities. And we talk about this even now when we're there in the summer in Kosovo, the differences between what happened in Bosnia and what happened in Kosovo. And one of them, quite frankly, was we had given them a constitution. At Dayton, the Constitution was written. It was in one of the annexes, and with the thought that at some point they would amend it and change it, so it would be easier to work for them. They didn't do it. They never did it. They still haven't done it because it serves the entities and establishes them as independent organizations, and so. That was a big issue to try and come around. How do you get the three presidents to work together if you don't have the mechanisms to do that? And it was a complicated kind of process. We were working on the economic side. We were working on the humanitarian side. We had things going in the right directions, but to try and get that political unity of effort out of those three entities, we still haven't done it. So it's a complication.
Absolutely. In Bosnia, what did it look like to negotiate between the roles that the military played and that the civilians played to ensure that mission creep did not occur?
That's a great question, and it was complicated because the military tasks were outlined in Annex 1B. And the civilian tasks, God, I can't remember what the annex number was, but the civilian tasks were in another annex. And they were very vague and kind of general. But the military tasks had been accomplished by probably mid-February. And so Admiral Smith said, we've got to start helping the civilians in the accomplishment of their mission tasks as well, which is a great idea. And so he was very much brought into the CivMil process then. And so There was one area in particular. The elections were important. As I mentioned before, this was going to be a good time to remove Karadzic, hopefully get the Republic of Srpska on the right line, but you can't do that unless you have voter registration rolls. And where were the voter registration rolls? Gone. Nobody knew where they were. There was certainly not any electronic files of it. So how are you going to recreate this? And it was a dilemma. So there was a woman, a civil affairs woman, E7, she was from Texas, who knew how to do this stuff. She had done it in her county back home. And so General Matthews found her, and I'm going to tell you a story about that too, about the skill sets. And we found her and a couple of other people, and they started recreating from other databases the voter registration rolls for Bosnia. And they took all this whole programming over to Naples, where the AF South headquarters was, Allied Forces South, and they produced the voter registration rolls for each of the districts and provinces in Bosnia in time for the elections. And the military then helped transport it. Because how do you get all this stuff out? There's no transportation grid. Certainly the government didn't have anything. And so the military provided transport to get the voter registration rolls out in time for the elections. So it was is it mission creep? Yeah, that's not a normal Army mission. But the fact that we could have the civilian acquired skills to do it was really important to the success of the CivMil operation. So we could help out the High Rep's office in doing that. And it was actually the OSCE who was responsible for voting, but they had forgotten that little key nugget that you need the voter registration roll. But it talks about the civilian acquired skills. Before we deployed from the Bronx, General Matthews, I think there were 52 of us in that deployment. He had us catalog our civilian skills. I was a banker, Larry was an environmental engineer. He's the water guy, so we had all of our skill sets, 52 of us. And one night at dinner, so General Shalikashvili came to visit us, and at dinner one night, Admiral Smith, Snuffy Smith, is hosting a dinner with Shalikashvili. And he turns to General Matthews and he says, "Sir, Tom's gonna show you something here." He says, and he gave him the list of the 52 civil affairs troops that were there and the civilian skills that they had. And Shally says, "This is a national treasure." And it was just great, to see something like that happen. And so they knew it, and Shally knew it. He knew civil affairs coming out of Provide Comfort. And so for Snuffy to get that, show it to him, showed the connectivity and the integration across it. And it was just we talked about where we were helping get the water system back running again. We had a guy who was from the MTA, and we were getting the bus system, the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York City. And he was getting the bus lines up again and the trolley cars, because that was important. We had a big problem with water, surprisingly. And Fred had the water filtration system that took care of the north part of the city, but it didn't go through all of it. And so we had to get that going. So it was really amazing. It was a good team effort on the CivMil side.
And just to clarify, that was Fred Cooney who had the
That was
water
Fred
system.
Cooney, yes. He had built that water purification system, even though the Bosniak leaders didn't want to turn it on.
Moving out of Bosnia and looking at the transition point between Bosnia and Kosovo, when you were getting ready to leave Bosnia, did you have any inkling that you would soon be returning to the Balkans for another mission set?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I mean, we hadn't heard much about Kosovo yet. There certainly, it wasn't enough to come up on our screen. It was fascinating because at that time, Albania collapsed. The government dissolved. There was no government in Albania. And I remember Carl Bildt walking in one morning to the morning brief and saying, "This is unheard of. A country in Europe collapsing." And so that had happened, and there was an intervention then by NATO. Sent a small force in, the EU sent some government officials in to get them back up and running again. It was caused by the collapse of a pyramid system. And that was, we knew there were problems in that part of the Balkans, but we had it hadn't risen to a very high level on the Kosovo side of things. Yeah, so we didn't, and look, I'd just been mobilized for the second time in about 6 years. The bank wasn't getting very happy with me, so I didn't think I was going to be going anywhere fast again. But yeah, it came along. It came along because the Kosovars started, obviously it escalated pretty heavily in late '98 and got to the fighting stage. We had the Kosovo verification mission in there. There were some attempts to try and negotiate. Rambouillet was one attempt that fell through. The Serbs said they would obey. They would quit the violence. They would cut back on the attacks. And so the Kosovo verification mission was sent in. They were observing the truce. And then the big massacre at Rachac happened. 63 people massacred in the village. And Ambassador Walker, who was head of the Kosovo verification mission, went in, took pictures, called President Clinton from the massacre site and said the Serbs are violating, and the bombing campaign began about 3 weeks later. So yeah, we started, once the bombing campaign started, then we knew there was probably going to be something happening. However, again, going back to our senior leadership guidance, the President of the United States was again reluctant to get involved in the Balkans. And he said, we are only going to do the bombing campaign. We not only won't do a land invasion, we won't even plan for a land invasion. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting at my desk at Citibank, and I get a call from the civil affairs guys at EUCOM, European Command. Mike, can you put a planning team together? For what? We're working on the land invasion, the campaign plan for Kosovo, and we need a civ mill annex. I said, wait a minute, didn't the president just say we weren't going to plan? Yeah, he did, but you know, NATO's going to start planning. And so I took a team, there were 4 of us, to shape headquarters. That was probably April, so the bombing campaign had been going on for about a month. And it wasn't getting the results that we needed. As a matter of fact, I got there a couple of days after the Chinese embassy was bombed. So there were some interesting things happening around that area then. But we developed a civ mill campaign plan for the intervention if there were a land invasion. And we had 2 options. One, permissive, i.e. they let us come in, or non-permissive. And we had lines of effort, all the tasks, key tasks, and civil affairs tasks, and CMO tasks, and who we would work with. And we had some pretty good, we had very good contact with a man from Mercy Corps, Jerry Hesselius. He had been there for 6 years. He stayed there during the bombing campaign. This guy was a legend. He had forgotten more about Kosovo than anybody else knew. He really knew what was happening and what were their coping mechanisms. He knew about the shadow government system because the Serbs made the Albanians close down their schools, close down their medical clinics. It all had to be Serbian. And so what the Albanians did is they set up a shadow system. You had schools, you had clinics, you had, so they had done all these things on their own. We were not aware of that, but obviously once we found out about it, one of our planning cycles was try to find these people who would run these things, because then you don't start from scratch. So yeah, it was an interesting planning operation with zero guidance. Because nobody in the United States was going to be supporting this. But we did it and came up with a campaign plan. So then fast forward, bombing campaigns going on, June comes, sitting at a civil affairs conference in Charleston, South Carolina. It is clear that the Serbs are about to give up. And saying, okay, we got to send a civil affairs team in. UCOM's asking for a team. We need to send some CIA folks in. There was a little side session at the conference, missing the talks, going off to talk about, okay, who's going to lead the team? And they were talking about people here, this guy, this woman, that guy. And I'm sitting there kind of going, and the general turns to me and he says, it was General Bingham, and he says, Mike, you look a little uncomfortable. What's going on? I said, well, sir, you know, I wrote the plan. He says, yeah, that's why you're here. And he says, you know, I don't think the ones we're talking about so far could do that. I said, really? I said, you know, and we talked about it a little bit. And he said, well, would you do it? And I said, well, you know, I just got back from Bosnia. So it would be, you know, it'd be a little bit of a challenge for the employer. He says, look, we'll just send you for 30 days. You get it up and running, you know the plan, get it going, and we'll send somebody in 30 days. I said, okay, I'll do it. And I agreed to put a team together and go in and implement the plan. And we put, there were 19 of us in that group that we pulled together and mobilized and went to Ramstein Air Force Base. We flew into there first and then went down to Camp Able Sentry in Macedonia. And then a couple of days after that, we were helicoptered up to the Film City in Pristina, which is where the K4 headquarters still is. And we landed in a helicopters, CH-47, 19 of us with all our gear, and including our tent. We had our own tent, a GP medium, all our cots. Landed in a field, it was raining, and we had arrived at K4 headquarters.
So they said 30 days. How long did you end up spending there total?
115.
Quite the shift.
Yeah, a little bit.
Now, when you got there, what did the dynamics look like with NATO and the UN again, and how is that different than the setup in Bosnia, if it was different?
It was different in that this was in fact a UN mission. And it was a UN peacekeeping mission. There was a resolution for it, 1244. There was interim SRSG.
SRSG being?
A special representative of the Secretary General. Thank you. That's good. And Sergio De Mello was the interim SRSG. He was a great guy. He was a super guy. And so he had gotten things started. He knew he was leaving. As a matter of fact, he was gone by the time I got there in early July. He actually went off to East Timor, and he became the SRSG in East Timor, another very successful peacekeeping operation. He was a great guy. He was killed in Baghdad when the bombing of the UN headquarters at the Canal Hotel. It was a tragic loss for the UN system. This guy was really wonderful. Great guy, a really big loss. But Sergio had been there. He had started setting up the UN mission in Kosovo, UNMIK, affectionately known as UNMIK. So we now had a UN charter, a UN organization, had a structure that was laid out. It was a very good structure. Only found out years later when I started teaching a course about the peacekeeping operation that the person who wrote that was a man named Lynn Hawley, who worked in the State Department of the Paul Mill office. And he had spent, after he retired from the Army, he spent some time on the Hill, and then he had worked in special operations, low intensity conflict at OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy. And so he handled peacekeeping operations for the military, the US military, when he was over there at Solik. Now he's over at Paul Mill. He sees the crisis coming, he wrote a plan for how the UN should implement a peace agreement in Kosovo. Wrote it up, sent it up to a friend of his. God, I should remember his name. This guy was killed in the Haiti earthquake. Another great guy in the UN DPKO, Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He said to the guy, he says, if you like it, use it. I won't tell a word. If you don't, throw it away. Became the base plan for the whole intervention for the UN. The 4-pillar system, how it was organized and structured. It was a brilliant plan. And it was all done by Len Hawley, and nobody ever knew about it. So, you know.
It says a lot about Len.
It was a great guy.
And he was a West Point graduate as well, wasn't he?
Class of 69, he was.
Talk about a legacy.
He was going to be an MI officer, but went armor and never left. He had the Hyde tank in Europe one year. So Len was an incredible man. Great loss when we. But, you know, Kosovo was an interesting operation in that. He had looked at the lessons learned and what was not good, or what was not optimal. It wasn't bad or good. It wasn't optimal. There were a lot of things in Bosnia that we could have done better. For example, rules of engagement. I remember early days. You know, we're training soldiers. We want to work with the NGOs. We want to help them. We want to help facilitate because they're the end state. It's a military operation with a civil military end state. Well, they're the end state. So we want to facilitate and make sure they succeed in these operations. Early on, a military unit came across a group of NGOs that were being attacked by the Serbs. And they didn't know what to do because the rules of engagement did not say anything about rules of engagement deal with how to use weapons in defense of yourself, primarily. So you can use deadly force if you're being attacked. But what about if an innocent civilian is being attacked? Do you have the right to use deadly force in that situation? It wasn't clear. And we hadn't clarified that in Bosnia. We fixed that. We fixed it very quickly in Bosnia and made it train the soldiers to know that they could intervene and protect civilians because we needed to do that. It was just common sense, but you needed to have it in the training, in the rules of engagement. So when we wrote the plan for Kosovo, we had it in from the beginning. Rules of engagement, if an international is threatened, you're allowed to use deadly force to protect them. So we learned some things like that were very important. Again, we didn't know which organizations were doing what in Kosovo, and it changes. But we knew we had to be flexible, so we had to be well organized going in. So you talk about other challenges in terms of structure. When we arrived, so 19 of us get out of this helicopter, all equipment, out in a field, trees all around us, and we look, where are we? Somebody said, I think the headquarters is over that way. And so the sergeant major and I go trundling off while the troops are getting all our gear together. And I get to the headquarters and I walk in and I find the G5 who is doing some mill operations. That's the way they had it set up in the NATO headquarters. The NATO headquarters came from the ACE, Allied Command Europe Rapid Reaction Corps, which was commanded by a British General, Sir Michael Jackson. Mike Jackson had been in Bosnia, commanded a division there, so he is an extremely well-versed in civil military operations. He also had many tours in Northern Ireland. So he was extremely good, and I'll tell you some stories about that in a minute. So Mike Jackson's headquarters, it's a British headquarters, so the 5 is where Sid Mill was, that's where they had it. And so I go in and I find the head of the 5, he's a Dutch colonel. And the Dutch were making a move at that time within NATO to try and find a niche for themselves. And they were going to take over what the NATO parlance calls CIMIC. What we call civil military operation, it's civil military coordination. So it goes back to World War II and the relationship with civil affairs then. So it was kind of complicated, but we knew it was CMO. And so he says, I said, we're here, we got 18 folks, special, and he goes, we don't need you. I go, excuse me? He says, we have a civic team here, and we don't need the American help. And I said, well, it's in the NATO order of battle and the manning charts, and we're here to fill that. Oh, it's going fine. The UN is going to bring in 6,000 civil police. They're going to take care of all that. We don't need your help in this. I said, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to sit here and argue with this guy. So I wasn't feeling warm and fuzzy and welcome, but you go, what are we going to do here? What are we going to do about this, Ranger? So I walked outside and I run into a big, tall brigadier general, U.S. Army. His name was Mike Maples. Mike Maples is a classmate. And it's, hi, how are you? What are you doing here? And I said, well, you should mention, he was, back then the structure in the ARC was the 2 and the 3 were combined under one brigadier general. So Mike had the intel side and the ops side under him. And so he was in charge of all the operational pieces. And I explained to him, I said, look, we got the civil affairs team, 19 people, and but the G5 doesn't think he needs us. And he just kind of looked at me and he smiled and he says, don't worry about that. He says, we need you. And says, come back in a little bit, we'll talk about it. So he goes off and talks to General Ridgway. Andy Ridgway was the chief of staff. I'm not sure if he ever got to Mike Jackson or if he ever had to. But Ridgway said, no, we need them. Settle them in, get them going, and we'll put them to work. So it just goes to show you networks, staying in touch with people, having a relationship was extremely important. Mike came to, he was the military aide to Secretary Marsh, and he came to one of the civil affairs conferences in New York City with Secretary Marsh. And so it was nice to see, and he was well connected and he knew how to handle this. So we were welcomed in, and what we did is we divided the roles up. I always brought a police officer who had worked in urban areas, because one of the things we figured out early on in the Sarajevo case, the police, they had police systems already intact in that country because they were existent before we came in. So you couldn't just dismiss them. We didn't have the authority to do that. So they had executive authority in their countries, in their parts of the country. And the Republic of Srpska police would sit around and they'd set up road blocks and shake people down for money. And you're going, well, that's horrible. We shouldn't ever be doing that. Police shouldn't be doing that. And then somebody turned to me and said, do you know how much those police officers are paid? And remember, what have they been doing for the last 40 years? They've been communist police. They were trained to follow foreigners and set up roadblocks. That's all they were ever trained to do. They are not beat cops. So we always brought police officers who were beat cops, who developed a relationship with their community. The one guy, Charlie Smith, was from South Philly. He was great at this. And so I took him again into Kosovo, and so we had a cell that worked with the UN Civpol. We had Larry went off into the water thing, as usual. We had another guy who was a state police officer. He was working on the OSCE, was responsible with setting up the judiciary. So he went off and worked with them. Office of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Wow, yeah, pulled that one out, didn't I?
Lots of acronyms going on.
Yeah, lots of acronyms. Sorry about that. So we were, and then so we had these tentacles out into, because UNMIC was divided into 4 pillars. First one was humanitarian assistance, which came under UNHCR. Second was institution building, which came under the OSCE. The third one was administration, because there was no government. Because the requirements of the military technical agreement was the Serbian military had to leave, Serbian police have to leave. Once that happened, all of the Serbian bureaucrats left too. There were no banks, there were no courts, there was nothing. Didn't have a water system, didn't have anybody to run it, nobody to run the power plant, they're all gone. As they say in Kosovo, they were zduku, gone. They were gone because they thought there might be some retribution coming. So you go in, so we needed people to administer, and the UN had the charter to do that under 1244. So these are all UN people now running the country until we could have elections and stuff like that. And then the fourth pillar was economic development, and that was run by the EU, and that was they were getting the banking system going again and all those things. So I did some work on that one. So we put people out in all of these pillars to help get information, to see where they needed help, and then KFOR would then, if they had the ability and the capability, help where they could.
And KFOR is the NATO force.
KFOR is the NATO force. And Mike Jackson knew that was important. To him, it was critical. And so Andy Ridgway, when I presented this plan to him, he said, that's great, let's go with it. So the SRSG, the Special Representative Secretary General, Bernard Kouchner, the one who was approved by the Secretary General, arrives on July 14th. So I'd been there about 6 days. I'm just this American guy hanging out at the headquarters trying to find a job, right?
Classic.
Yeah, just looking around, kind of seeing how things are going. And Bernard arrives. And so two things. One, he's met at the airport by Sir Michael Jackson, General Jackson, meets him at the airport. And he says at the press conference, now it is the time for the military to assume its appropriate role in support of the civilian authorities. Great, that's exactly what you want to hear. So he was all in. So from the very beginning, from the top down, it is Mike Jackson, Bernard Kouchner. They met every day at 5 o'clock. Every day. Bernard Kouchner would come up to KFOR, to the headquarters. They'd go into his office. They would meet for, sometimes it was 15 minutes, sometimes it was an hour. Every day, Saturday, Sunday, didn't make a difference. You talk about coordination, it was beautiful. So we didn't have any trouble on the leadership side. Certainly Andy Ridgway, the Chief of Staff, supported that. And so he supported our concept of working with all these, the 4 pillars and the organizations underneath them. We sent the teams out to find out where the coordination meetings were going, so that were happening all over the town. And so we were getting pretty well set up pretty quickly in Kosovo. It actually got set up very quickly in Kosovo.
And what point did you run into Jock Covey again?
Interesting, Jock Covey. So Bernard walks into the staff meeting that night at 5 o'clock. And he comes up and Sir Michael had him sit right next to him. All of a sudden I see this white-haired guy walk in next to him. And he sits down next to him. I go, I'm sitting in the back because, I'm not a front row kind of guy. And I'm looking around and I says, holy shit, that's Jock. Unbeknownst to me, Jock is the deputy SRSG. So the staff meeting's over, everybody wants to go shake hands with Bernard Kouchner, and they're gathering around there, all these colonels and generals and stuff. And I'm kind of hanging back there. And Jock looks up and he goes, holy shit, is that Mike? And everybody, what? And Bernard, he grabs Bernard and he says, you got to meet this guy. And he pulls Bernard away from these guys and he says, Mike, this is Bernard Kouchner of the SRSG, and we hug, I hug Jock first, obviously. And then Bernard, and we're talking about, where you're from, And he had worked in the Bronx. When I told him I was from the Civil Affairs Unit, we were in the Bronx, he worked at a VA hospital in the Bronx, right down from our reserve center. Just an amazing guy.
And Bernard Kouchner founded MSF.
Medicine Sans
Doctors Without
Frontières.
Borders.
Absolutely. So I mean, this is just an amazing individual. I mean, he's quick. He's thinking all the time. Maybe not the most organized, but Jock is extremely organized. He's the process guy. So he's got it all, you know. You got the fast-thinking political guy over here, and you got the guy over here who's going to make the trains run on time. They were an amazing team. So I'm sitting there, Bernard Kouchner and I are talking, and Jock's hugging me, and the rest of the staff is going, huh, that's what Civ Mill's all about, huh? Maybe this guy Hess does know something, you know? And it was all based on relationships. So Jock and I are back at it again. And I'd go down and meet with him a couple of times a week. But more importantly, it's where I met my wife. So Teresa was set up IPCO, Internet Service Provider Kosovo. She and another American named Paul Myers, Akan and Buyar were the two Kosovars who worked on it. So the four of them set up the first internet service provider in Pristina after the war. Their offices were right next to the CEMIC Center, the British CEMIC Center downtown in the sports hall. And I used to go down maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and I would give the security presentation to the NGOs. And it's not like a normal security briefing. It's not like a military security briefing. You're not worried about how many tanks are in the first echelon, and you're not worried about that. But there was a lot of carjacking going on. There were things like that happening. There were mines. We still had a lot of mines all over the place. We had maps, which they needed. So I would go down and do the security briefings, 2 or 3, and her office was right there. And sometimes she'd come down and, we'd get to know each other. So we did, and that's where we met. We met, and so Kosovo was near and dear to my heart, and near and dear to her heart. We still both worked there, so a lot. So we love the country, we love the people, and it's always going to be very dear to us because that's where we met.
Sounds amazing.
It was.
We'll talk more about your continued involvement in Kosovo in the next interview.
Okay.
But kind of going towards the wrap up of Kosovo and a wrap up of your civil affairs career in general, what were some of the most significant moments in civil and military coordination in Kosovo that you witnessed personally that facilitated an intervention that has been largely successful and has created a country that's well on its way to great success?
You look at a couple of things. You look at something like the police force, the creation of the police force. We know it's against the law for a military to do that. It's certainly against the law in Title 10 of the U.S. Code. It was for the British Army as well. So we couldn't train police. That's not why we were there. I had Charlie Smith, who would go in and work with the UN CivPol. Okay, but we've helped them facilitate it through a couple of ways. One, you had to recruit people, okay? And we started recruiting, I'm talking about the international community, UNMIC, OSCE in particular, started recruiting for the first class in July of '99. So think about that. We'd been
really
in country
fast.
really fast, because we knew we needed, because there were no police. They'd gone to Zhduku. So who was doing the policing? KFOR. Military soldiers are not good policemen. You should never use military for police. We knew that, but we had to. We were fortunate because the British had been trained in Northern Ireland, and we used a lot of their techniques. All the other countries did too, and they could do a good job. And we didn't have major security problems. But we knew we needed to get a police force. So we started recruiting early on. And I remember the morning it began, I remember because I was right by the UN headquarters, and the police station was right across the street from the UN headquarters. And I walked by there, and all these people are lined up outside, waiting to get to the window because they were going to be passing out applications for the police force. And I would go, wow, look at that. 8 o'clock in the morning, lines, wanting to be police officers. And a lot of women in that line too. I'll get back to that. So I'm looking at that. I say, Charlie, what's going on? Why's the line so long? He says, they haven't opened the window yet. They haven't started passing out the applications. He goes in there. He's hot. You remember, he's from South Philly. Pulls out his badge, his Philadelphia police officer badge. He slams it on the table. He says, these people are out there. They care about the policing of their country, and you guys are sitting in here on your ass. Open that window, pass out those applications. You go, yeah. So the people were there, and they were a quarter of the applicants were women. In Bosnia, we had zero. So it just shows you it's different. You think you know what you're doing, but you don't, because you really don't know what's happening there. So that was amazing. So we start recruiting. Then we had to build a police academy. There was OSCE had picked a guy. He was a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, very well organized. We, K4, they needed some help engineering-wise. We have engineers. They go up and help build some buildings and obstacle courses and ranges for the police officers to work, the future police officer to do weapons training. They helped build the facility. Can't run the facility, but we can help facilitate the construction of the facility. So we did that, and the academy was opened in mid-August. I want to say the 18th or 19th.
That's incredible.
And the first class started. You go, wow, big success in a very short period of time. You look at the Kosovo police today, they are probably one of the highest rated police forces in Europe. They are extremely high respected. The third president of Kosovo, President Yaga, she was a police officer. I think she was in the second class. I would have to check that. She was in the second or third class. So I mean, it's a great institution, big success story. The other one is the humanitarian relief. It was an extremely difficult place to operate because there was only one main supply route into Kosovo. We call them MSRs. There was one road. It came from Skopje through the Kačanik defile up into the plains of the high plains of Kosovo up to Pristina. That was the only road in. The road through Albania was a little shady, not very well developed, because Albania didn't have much in the way of trade with them. Montenegro, it's still bad, as you know. Yeah. The road to Montenegro was horrible. And obviously the roads into Serbia we weren't going to use, because the Serbs were going to let us use them. So we had one road coming in. All the military equipment had to come in through there. All the humanitarian relief supplies. We had to get 600,000 tons of food in for the winter. How do you do that, Ranger? You know, and you got one road, and the military, of course, has priority on the road. No, you shouldn't have that. So there was a lot of deconfliction that had to happen there, too. One of the things we had to do, there was a rail line that ran from Skopje up through the Kačanik defile, all the way to Pristina, and then on to Mitrovica and out to Peja. Partially destroyed during the bombing campaign, but we had to do something about it. So I love trains. I went and I loved World Food Program and food distribution, knew how important it was. And so if we could get like the food delivery stuff off the road, get the bulk products delivered up for Pristina, even out to Peja into Mitrovica by rail, we'd be way far ahead. The British donated 20 locomotives, and they drove them from England all the way down to Kosovo. That's not an easy trip. But what do you have to have if you're going to operate a locomotive? You need insurance. And somebody on the staff said, insurance? Why do you need? And I'm going, uh-oh. Well, I used to cover the insurance companies as a banker.
Imagine that.
And I said, you need insurance? Here, call these 3 companies, they'll give you a quote. Really? Yeah. We got insurance, we could move the locomotives, we got them in, and I got to drive one of the locomotives. It was a hoot. It was a hoot. So we had some pretty major successes, and that winter, which was a horrible winter, you could ask Teresa, it was really cold because the electrical power system was horrible. And one of my big mistakes was to put Kosovo, they're called Kosovo A and B, they're the two power plants. They're lignite coal-fired power plants. They are dirty, they are nasty, they are environmentally unsound, and very unreliable. So we had very intermittent electricity the whole first year, actually the whole first 4 years. We should have put it on the bombing list. I put it on the do not bomb list because it's an electrical power plant. Should have let them blow it up and we could have built a new one because they still haven't replaced them. It's horrible. It's horrible. But you know, nobody died from lack of food, water, sanitation. It was a great operation on the humanitarian relief side. So the people, it built their faith and trust in the international intervention. The last military they knew that was there had been the Serbian military. They were not used to a military to work with them, and the people started to respect that a lot. And they respected UNMIC because they were in charge of the humanitarian side of it. So it started to build the confidence of the Kosovo people and the rest of the processes. And the admin system went pretty well. We were getting judges in. Jock had us get 20 million Deutschmarks to pay the judges. Had to bring that money in, fly it in, and then find a place to store it. That was another interesting story, and especially when we couldn't find the second guy with the second key. He vanished on us at the last minute. But you know, you got $20 million kind of laying around for a while on a Friday afternoon. But we made it through. Okay.
You found it, got it back? All right.
Yeah, not till Monday. We put the money in my office for the weekend. $20 million Deutschmarks. Okay, we had a great party. No party. No party. But you know, it was again a very successful operation. And I think when you look at peacekeeping operations, it's one of the ones that's been successful because if you look at the book and you look at the four pillars that we were working in. First was the political side, developing the political, re-energizing the political systems within the country so they could have local elections and then work their way up to national elections. That happened, again, pretty quickly. Not successfully, but quickly. Because as Jock likes to point out, and Bernard Kouchner pointed out, the first elections are not going to go well. They're going to vote for the wrong people, but they'll figure it out and go, huh, that guy really wasn't who he said he was. And you can have the next elections, and you get there through the process. Security, we established security pretty quickly. KFOR provided it initially. We started, the police, Kosovo police were not going to take over for about 3.5 years. We were also fighting organized crime. There was big organized crime in Kosovo that we had to fight. So we had to go back to NATO headquarters and ask for the Carabinieri to come in and help us with that. That was complicated. That was really complicated. But we did pretty well on the security side. Rule of law, OSCE and UNMIC worked very well together to get the rule of law reestablished. And people began to respect the authority again. And on the Paul Econ side, it was Jolie Dixon instituted taxes at the border on goods coming in. And people are going, why is he doing that? We should just let everything in for these people. But he said, no, it was a small tax. They got to get used to paying taxes. The black market's gone. The gray market's gone. We want them to rely on a free market economy. They got to see that they got to have taxes. We got to have taxes for the revenue for this country. We need to start it from the very beginning, not try to institute it. Turned out it was brilliant, you know, and it worked. So is Kosovo an economic powerhouse today? No, but they're doing okay. They're doing okay. So when you look at all four of them, and they worked very well together, under the leadership of Bernard Kouchner and Jack Covey, did a great job. And you could really see it in the relationship between KFOR. From Mike Jackson and Bernard Kouchner all the way down, we had joint planning cells that worked together. We had working with the police together, all the way down through the whole country. It was an extremely well-coordinated operation on the civil mill side. Military operation, civil, military, and state.
That leads us into our wrap-up questions.
No.
So looking at your civil affairs career, the first question being, what was the most challenging and or frustrating thing about working within civil affairs?
Nobody understands civil affairs in the U.S. military. You're always, at the time, 96% of it was in the reserve force structure. So they had never seen them. I had never seen one. I didn't know what they were when I became a civil affairs officer. So you just never saw them. So how do we use them? It's like a pig looking at a wristwatch. I like that, but I don't know what it does. You know, it doesn't happen. So you're constantly educating people. And remember, I gave you the example. You know, General Benchoff wouldn't see us about the CA plan and for provide comfort. He didn't have time. He was a busy man, you know, but he didn't say, hey, we got to get civil affairs involved in this because this is a civil military crisis. He didn't know, they didn't know, and they don't know, and they don't know what to ask for. Well, if you don't know what to ask for, how are you going to get involved and how can you help out? So it's always been frustrating that you were constantly educating people about what civil affairs. We fought to get it into the curriculum, but when you look at the military educational structures, you don't get it in your basic course. You don't get it in your advanced course. You may get a hint of it at a command and general staff college or something on that level. First time you run into it is at the war college at that level, you know, which is the senior professional development, you know, and then it's too late. So building the relationships with those commanders and provide comfort were critical. Because once General Zinni knew, once General Shalley knew, once General Jamerson knew, once they and General Jones and all those guys who went on, John Abizaid was in Provide Comfort. All those guys knew then, going forward, and when the boss asks, hey, how about those civil affairs guys? Then the troglodytes, you know, go, maybe we ought to ask about that. That was always extremely frustrating.
The last question is, what was the most rewarding part of working in civil affairs?
Well, meeting my wife was obviously the most rewarding part. But at the end of the day, you know, I could always say, and people say, I never, as a banker, never made a difference in a person's life. But as a civil affairs officer, I did. And that's important. You know, when you take, we were losing 300 kids a day in northern Iraq. We had the death rate down below the national average in a month and a half, meeting Fred Cooney, and he changed my life. I mean, that's just, you can't make that up. And go into Bosnia, where they've been fighting each other for 4 years, and they give them a chance to not kill each other. You know, as Jock likes to say, they weren't stuffing hand grenades down each other's pants anymore. You know, that's good. You know, is it perfect? No. We got a long way to go there. Going into Kosovo, you know, bringing peace there, extremely successful peacekeeping operation, being part of that, and meeting Teresa there. It didn't get any better than that. So yeah, when you can make a difference in somebody's life, that's pretty rewarding.